Welcome to Peninsula Seniors Out and About. We're at the Western Museum of Flight in Torrance. Let's go see what Cindy has for us today.
Welcome everyone to the Western Museum of Flight. I'm Cindy Maka, the director. Lynn Jensen is an accomplished and knowledgeable engineer who has applied his technical skills to his principal avocation, which is conducting historical research in the field of the development of the world's combat aircraft, particularly World War II. And today he's going to share some of the fruits of his labor of love, and I'm sure we are in for a fascinating time, so let it roll, Lynn.
I originally gave this presentation in a shorter form at Northrop Grumman on, as you can see, Battle of Britain Day 2016. I've upgraded it a little bit, but I wanted to leave that because that is the day. Every year at Northrop Grumman, I send out an email to everyone on the F-18 program, which I'm on now. September 15th, Battle of Britain Day, I send them a special note and a chart that commemorates this battle. It was called the most, afterwards, at the time it certainly wasn't this way, but afterwards it was called the most romantic air battle. This was after the movie and things like that, not during the time. And of course the symbol of that battle, it was the Supermarine Spitfire, and I wanted to go into some of the design details and some of the politics and things that made the Spitfire famous, and then talk about the battle itself. There's so much that's been written on this battle, and truly I can say that without that air superiority that the Spitfire, the Royal Air Force Fighter Command, and the Hurricanes provided, our civilization would be quite different. We might be speaking German now, I don't know. Guten Tag. But because of this airplane and its stablemate, the Hawker Hurricane, that was not so. The battle was very, very dramatic. Oh, by the way, if you have a question, below my name is I'm on the F-18 program management SEAT. That's a Systems Engineering and Integration Team. So if you had questions about that acronym, we live in a world of acronyms these days, so I thought I'd explain that right away. And of course, everybody knows the acronym RAF. I unfortunately could only bring a 1/72nd scale Spitfire. I would have liked to fly my own Spitfire in for the day, but this was all I could manage. But this is a Battle of Britain Spitfire Mark I. DW is the squadron code for 610 Squadron, I believe. The 600 RAF squadrons were kind of the Air National Guard, and they were really the pilots were usually wealthy young men, and basically their squadron was like a flying club. In fact, in the 30s they called the Royal Air Force the greatest flying club in the world. I wanted to start out by giving you an idea of the sources that I use. These are the principal sources, and I would recommend these books. Top one on the list is called Spitfire, the History, Eric B. Morgan and Edward Shacklady. This is a massive book, 3 inches thick, large format, you know, the coffee table format, but it has details you would not believe. It is the definitive history of the Spitfire, and it's well worth reading from a technical, historical aspect. It's just full of treasures. It's an Aladdin's cave of treasures on the Spitfire. And of course, everybody should read Len Dayton. Now, you know, Len Dayton wrote the book for the movie The Ipcress File, the old spy movies and things. But he also wrote a very carefully balanced and excellently researched book on the Battle of Britain. It's called Fighter. Others you can see on the list, the Battle of Britain, excellent. You look them up under the authors here. Of course, Bill Gunston has to be there. Bill Sweetman is now a colleague at Northrop Grumman, and you know Bill Sweetman is a tremendous air historian and journalist, and Bill Sweetman called Bill Gunston the Yoda of aviation journalism. So we wouldn't want to miss Bill Gunston's book. Of course, I grew up on this book. I got a special, when I was a kid, about 8 years old, I got special permission from the librarian upstairs in the library for adults. The kids were downstairs. This was in Brigham City, Utah, Minuteman missile country. I got special permission to go upstairs and check out this one book from the adult library, and it was William Greene's Famous Fighters of the Second World War. So I grew up reading and rereading that book. And of course, Alfred Price's Spitfire at War, Battle of Britain, R.G. Overy is a very good analysis, written recently about some of the information and some of the analyses that were not available earlier. You know, Ian Fleming, the author who created James Bond, had an older brother. His older brother was named Peter Fleming, and Peter Fleming wrote the most entertaining and beautiful, fun book. Of course, it's historically accurate. It's called Operation Sea Lion. And he has such a knack for a humorous British understatement that this book in itself is just worth reading because it is so entertaining. So I recommend that. One I realized just now, I forgot to put on the list, is a book called The Man Who Won the Battle of Britain. And can anyone guess who that might be? The man who won the Battle of Britain? Yes, correct, absolutely. You win the prize. Hugh Dowding. He was the head of Fighter Command, and he had his preparation in the 30s meant that the Germans really would not have a chance. So Hugh Dowding's, the best book on Hugh Dowding that I've read is called The Man Who Won the Battle of Britain. So with that, we'll proceed to the man who designed the Supermarine Spitfire. Reginald Joseph Mitchell was a commander of the British Empire, a fellow of the Royal Aeronautical Society. He was born in 1895 and died in 1937 of cancer, actually. He joined Supermarine in 1917. They made him chief designer a couple of years later. That showed he had talent. Now remember that Supermarine means on the water, right? Or over the water. So basically, Supermarine was in the business of building and designing seaplanes. And there are some famous ones that Mitchell came up with. We'll talk about those later. But Mitchell had an approach much like Deming had with quality. And we've all heard of Deming and his ideas about how you attain quality in aircraft and other production. Basically, his idea was if you make things simple, then it enhances quality. If it's simple to do, you don't have to worry that much about quality. Avoid complexity. And I love this quote from Mitchell: if anybody ever tells you anything about an aeroplane which is so bloody complicated you can't understand it, take it from me, it's all balls. And we can see in the beautiful lines of the Spitfire what he was talking about. And of course, he didn't like the name Spitfire for his airplane. You can see the quote below. Spitfire was just the sort of bloody, silly name they would choose. But it turns out it was perfect for this airplane. Well, I'm sure everyone is familiar with the famous poem. The U.S. Air Force used to use it when TV stations used to sign off at midnight. Just before they signed off, they would show a Northrop T-38 flying in the, soaring in the sun. And the voiceover for those beautiful shots of the T-38 flying was John Gillespie McGee's poem, High Flight. So I kind of grew up with that too, because I would watch TV until midnight just so I could see that T-38 flying through the sunlit heavens and hear this poem recited. Oh, I have slipped the surly bonds of earth and danced the skies on laughter-silvered wings. Sunward I've climbed and done 100 things you have not dreamed of. So here in my researches, I found a picture of the pilot who wrote that, sitting, of course, in his Spitfire. He was anxious to get into the war. He was just a young student, but he was in the U.S., and he was trying to get back to Canada so that he could join the Royal Canadian Air Force and get into World War II, fly, in other words. He loved airplanes. There is actually the letter that he wrote with that poem on it to his family. So basically, he was interviewed by the Washington Times, and they, in the interview, he talked to them, told them what he wanted to do, and they basically characterized him as happy at having won his wings, more so at the prospect of flying a Spitfire, the ultimate dream of every British flyer, he said, and the prospect of, this is the typical British understatement, the prospect of a little action. Well, it turns out he died tragically. He got to take a few shots at Messerschmitts, but tragically he died when his Spitfire was hit by there was an aerial collision with a training aircraft, and so that was his demise. Let's look at some other Mitchell designs. Speaking about Supermarine, we have now this is ironic because one of his first designs, and this was in, I believe, the 1921 Snyder race as a competitor for an air race to, I think it went about 145 miles an hour. I don't remember if it won, but it was at least placed. But ironically, this airplane was named the Sea Lion. Another famous plane that Mitchell designed was the Supermarine Walrus, which basically rescued hundreds of flyers when they had to ditch in the Atlantic or the English Channel, etc. Interestingly enough, Mitchell designed a 6-engine flying boat. It was never built, but you can see at this time this airplane had the characteristic elliptical wing, which for aerodynamicists has a special characteristic. Does anyone remember what the special characteristic of an elliptical wing is? Uniform, that's close, uniform wing loading. It's actually a uniform coefficient of lift over the entire span of the wing. So this is a nice thing to have. It simplifies the design process. So obviously, simplifies drag, it simplifies a lot of things. And of course, we're looking at simplicity. This flying boat was never built, but this is where that elliptical wing idea kind of stuck in Mitchell's mind. Now, in the lower right corner, you see the Supermarine S6B, which in 1931 took the Snyder Trophy forever for England, for Great Britain, at a speed of 407 miles per hour. And in that beautifully streamlined racing plane, we don't see that elliptical wing, but we do see that fuselage that is just a fantastic streamlining. It just could not get more sleek as a trainer. Now, let's look at a very great contrast between the sleek, just killer lines of the S6B racer, Snyder Trophy winner, to the first Spitfire. There it is, folks. Looking in all its glory like a Ju-87 Stuka dive bomber that the Luftwaffe used. It's got the reverse gull wings, the fixed landing gear, the spats on the landing gear, just like a Stuka, and it was about contemporary with Stuka. Of course, other airplanes had that reverse gull wing, which were very effective, and some people would say that one of those, the Chance Vought Corsair F4U, was the top performing fighter plane in World War II. It's very controversial, but that is one of those. So that reverse gull wing was something that was kind of in style. And of course, in this case, as in the case of the Corsair, they wanted to have that reverse gull wing so they didn't have to make the landing gear longer than necessary for the propeller to clear the ground. So there we see the Supermarine Type 224. This was the result of a specification, a requirement from the Air Ministry, RAF. They wanted a fighter plane that would go 50% faster than the gauntlets and the bi-wing planes could at the time. and they wanted it to carry 4 machine guns rather than just the 2 that we'd had around since the Sopwith Camel. This was a requirement, F7/30. F meant fighter, 7 was the 7th specification of the year /1930. So these were some of the contenders in this competition. You can see the Blackburn 123 was a strange-looking bird. It was a biplane. It looks kind of like it's upside down. The pilot sat in the top, way up there. He probably needed a step ladder or a ladder to get up there in the first place. How did he get up there? I don't know, actually. Then there's a bottom wing, and that one was a little too radical for the Royal Air Force. It would be radical today, and its stealth characteristics would be terrible. The Bolton Paul, who later came up with the Defiant fighter, which was kind of like a Hurricane, but with a turret on behind the pilot, which they used in the Battle of Britain, but quickly they had to change to night fighting because Messerschmitts figured out that, hey, they can't keep their guns trained on us if we're on their tail. So that was it for the Bolton Paul. The Bolton Paul monoplane was a fairly advanced twin-engine airplane, fast and everything, but if you notice, look at the structure of that. It's still got guy wires and things to keep the structure straight, to give it strength and everything. Anyway, the 224 looked good. It had a tremendously advanced cooling system. The engine would be cooled by water, which the engine, from its heat, would turn into steam, and then that steam would be circulated through the front of the wing, etc., and cooled down to water again, and then it would be recycled through the engine. Well, in 1934, when the chief test pilot at Supermarine, Mutt Summers, tried to take this thing off, they had so much trouble with the cooling system that the RAF said, well, let's rethink this thing. So guess what airplane won the competition? Anybody have any ideas? This airplane, the Gloucester Gladiator. It was obsolescent before it even came into operation, but there it was. This is how these competitions go sometimes. I won't say anything more, but we've all seen it. The best plane does not always win. Moving on, Mutt Summers' comment as he got out of the 224 was, "We can do better than that." He had worked closely with Mitchell, and he knew Mitchell was a genius. So basically, Supermarine's board of directors said, okay, Mitchell, we're going to support you. We're going to use our private funds for you to design a fighter that is the best fighter you can possibly come up with. So for the next few slides, we're going to look at the development of this killer fighter. First of all, on the far left, there's the revised F730 Spec 425, which basically is it's lost the reverse gull wings, it's got a retractable landing gear, it's able to carry bombs, and it's got 4 machine guns which still fire through the propeller. So that means you have to fire more slowly. You know, the interrupter gear doesn't allow the machine guns to fire at the rate that they are capable of. The middle picture is the revised F730 Spec 425A, and you can see that it's starting to look a little bit sleeker. The guns now, 2 of the guns anyway, fire outside of the propeller arc. This airplane looks much like, for the aficionados here, the Heinkel HE-112. We could go into that sometime later. Anyway, but Heinkel does figure in the elliptical wing, as we'll see in a few minutes. Basically, the final design for the F730 Spec 425 before the elliptical wing, look at that wing, from the side it's starting to look like the Spitfire we're familiar with. The landing gear is looking like the Spitfire, but no elliptical wing. Okay, final design for F730 Spec 425 before the elliptical wing on the far left there is very interesting, because that wing is a strange sort of mathematical shape. You know, But you can see in the back of Mitchell's mind was, okay, now we've got all the guns, four machine guns, outside of the propeller arc, and we need room to put, to arm those guns, the ammunition and this sort of thing for those guns in that wing. And we also want to have the aerodynamic characteristics of the elliptical wing. So now, drawing 30,000, sheet 13, here is the elliptical wing, and the RAF, when they saw this, said, hey, we're writing a specification around this airplane. So it was F-3734, 1934. They said, okay, now we want this airplane. And so they specifically wrote a spec so that Supermarine would produce this airplane. That's always nice when you can have the Air Force write a specification around your airplane. And then you see basically on the right specification F-1035, which was a Spitfire with fillets on the wings, 8 machine guns, still has a two-bladed prop, wooden prop, by the way. But there it is. There's the Spitfire. And look at the, I want you to look at that, up near the engine, we've got the exhaust pipe. That was an ejector type exhaust pipe. They wanted to get every bit of thrust they could, so they funneled the exhaust from the engine through this, they call it a T exhaust, out over the wing so that it would provide more air going over the wing and more lift. There's the 8-gun wing of the embryonic Spitfire, we'll call it. And what a wing that was. The man who worked with Mitchell to design that wing was named Shenstone. You can see that the spar was a special lightweight version. Inboard toward the fuselage, it was a channeled metal which kind of telescoped, and then it was held in place by a web matrix, but it was very strong and very light. The wing actually had a twist and a downwash to it. There was a higher downwash at the fuselage wing root than there was on the tip. There was a little bit of a twist on the tip. And we see this on the Japanese Zero as well. Horikoshi designed the Zero for the same reason. He put a little twist, downward twist on the wingtips, so that when you're approaching a stall for the Spitfire, when you approach the stall, the wingtip would not stall out first. The wing root would stall out first. The airplane would shudder, but it wouldn't fall off into a spin like most airplanes do. Take your typical Cherokee or 172. And there's nothing like a spin when you're trying to draw a bead on an enemy Heinkel bomber, right? Or slow down enough to knock a Stuka out of the sky. So this was a fantastic, beautiful wing. And novelists, pre-war days, there was a fictional version. I mean, the British, since the turn of the century, since 1902, were always worried about Germans invading Britain. So again, this became a meme in the atmosphere, thought sphere, and so there was a novel written about these beautiful elliptical wing fighters that saved Britain from the German invasion. The elliptical wing. After the war, Shenstone was accused of, hey, you just cribbed, that's British for you just copied or stole the wing of the Heinkel HE-70, which was the fastest airplane of its day. The Condor Legion used it as a bomber, as a transport plane, a messaging plane. It was fast. But basically, Mitchell was in contact with Heinkel, and this is a quote from a letter he sent. We at Supermarine Aviation were particularly impressed with your airplane since we have been unable to achieve such smooth lines in the aircraft that we entered for the Snyder Trophy races. In addition to this, we recently investigated the effect that installing certain new British fighter engines. Now see, he's trying to sell British Kestrel engines to the Germans. This is a marketing effort, a disguised marketing effort. All those who have been in the aerospace industry know how this works. So he's praising the HC-70, and it was praiseworthy, let me tell you. We were dismayed to find that your new aircraft, despite its larger measurements, is appreciably faster than our fighters. It is indeed a triumph. Heinkel basically used this plan form and layout to design the principal bomber of the Battle of Britain, the Heinkel 111. As you can see, add a couple of engines, put on that bottom picture, put a cockpit, a glazed cockpit like a B-29 in the front, and you've got a Heinkel 111 bomber. And it was a fast bomber, but by the time of Battle of Britain, it was not as fast as it should have been. It was starting to become a little obsolescent, but it was used entirely through the war. Now, Shenstone replied later, "It has been suggested that we at Supermarine had cribbed the wing shape from that of this HE-70 transport. This was not so. The elliptical wing had been used on other aircraft, and its advantages were well known, as we can see from that 6-engine floatplane design of Mitchell earlier. Our wing was much thinner than that of the Heinkel, and had a quite different section. And this is another of the things that was really, really great about the Spitfire wing, is it was very thin, very, very thin. In any case, it would have been simply asking for trouble to have copied a wing shape from an aircraft designed for an entirely different purpose." So there we go. If anybody asks, that's your answer. Here is a Type 300, which they named that we can do better than that airplane, the dream airplane that they told Mitchell he could design. Originally, they were looking at radiators like on the P-40 Kitty Hawk, the chin radiator, this sort of thing. But a guy named Meredith came up with a much better idea. Let's put the radiator under the wing, position it so that it gets the amount of air intake that it needs, and then we'll design it so that the heat from the engine, it's kind of like a little jet engine. The heat from the engine from the radiator will expand, and combined with the airflow coming into the Meredith radiator, you would get more lift, not more lift, but you would get more thrust coming out of the back of that radiator. And just like the P-51 Mustang, you can adjust the aperture at the back of the radiator so that you can maximize the extra thrust you get from that radiator. Again, that's genius. Okay, so then we see basically the side view, and that, with that beautiful tail, is the basic Spitfire Mark I that we see. Still the twin blade wooden propeller. But you notice under that tail, there was one last detail that we had to take care of. It still had a skid, just like a Sopwith Camel. So somebody said, let's put a tail wheel on this, and then we'll get it into production. And here we go. First flight, 5 March 1936. When Mutt Summers got out of the airplane after flying that beautiful, beautiful airplane, he said, "Don't touch anything. It's perfect." Now, we all know test pilots who got out of airplanes and they said, "Okay, we got to work on this, we got to work on this. This is, this is a little shaky, this is a little weak." Mutt Summers, don't touch anything. The engine. We all know that when you design an airplane, the most important thing is your engine. The fighters, the American fighters in the late 40s, early 50s were handicapped because the jet engines could not provide the thrust that they needed to fully take advantage of the aerodynamic qualities of their airplanes. So here is that beautiful engine. In the upper left is the R-25R. That was a large, powerful engine. I think it put out almost 3,000 horsepower, and that's what they had in the Supermarine S6B. That's why it could go 407 miles an hour. You can see just beneath that the S6B and the engine being put into it. It looks like when you're at the dentist, how are they going to fit that thing in there? Open wide. How is it going to get in there? It doesn't look like it's going to fit, but it did. And then, of course, the Spitfire Mark I had the first Merlin engine. Between the R-25R and the Merlin was the first Merlin was called the Kestrel. And this was again, a world-beating engine, a tremendous V12 engine. Spitfire Mark I had the first Merlin engine, as did the Hurricane, and the Merlin engine also provided power for the P-51 Mustang. It's interesting, at the beginning of the war, the British, who needed America, they wanted to tap into American production capability, came to Henry Ford, Ford Motor Company, and said, "Will you build us these Merlin engines? We need them badly." At the time, the U.S. was not in the war. Henry Ford was a rather cranky, cantankerous character, and he said, "No, I won't do that. I'm an American. I'm not going to build something for you British." So the British went to Packard Motor Company, and Packard said, yeah, we'll build it. And they built thousands of Packard Merlin engines. And it's interesting that they actually, through their manufacturing ability and analyses, they actually made the production of that engine much more efficient. So they were able to produce better engines, higher quality, at a lower cost. And many of these Packard-built engines were in Spitfires as well, not just in the Mustangs. And they powered all. They had a separate designation for the Packard Merlin Spitfires. The Spitfire Mark 16, for example, was a Mark 9, but it had a Packard-built Merlin engine in it. Then they needed more power for the Spitfire and other airplanes, so Rolls-Royce developed the Griffon engine. Merlin had a top capability of about 1,700 horsepower, and then with boost maybe 18 or so. The Griffon could go up to maybe 2,500 horsepower. So you wanted this in an airplane, so they put it in a Spitfire, and Spitfires after the Mark 9 basically had the Griffon engine in them. And this meant they were fast. But there was one problem. The Griffon engine turned the propeller in the opposite direction of the Merlin engine. So if you're a pilot, you are very, very careful when you're taking off, because that torque, you're used to torque pulling you one way. Now you're in an airplane where the torque is going to pull you the other way. And so there were a lot of training situations where they had to be very, very careful. And of course, we see the Griffon, that sleek Spitfire Mark 24, which was basically the last of the Spitfires, and that had a Griffon engine. And look at the difference. You know, I forget the name of the journalist, but he said the Spitfire Mark I, the one on the left there, was like a ballerina. It was beautiful, graceful, especially compared to the Mark 24. Look at that. That is pure engine power. We had to be careful when we were priming the engine of the Spitfire. You can see in the lower left, in the middle there, there's a giant flame coming out of the exhaust pipes of this Spitfire. Well, basically, you had a little pump that you would put 3 little pumps, which would prime the engine, and then you would turn the ignition, and the engine would start. If you got too much in there, this is what would happen. You'd have a giant flame come out from the exhaust pipes as you were starting the engine. Interestingly enough, the first Messerschmitt 109 was powered by a Rolls-Royce engine. They couldn't get the DB601 Daimler-Benz in time to fly the first prototype of the Messerschmitt, so Messerschmitt, of course, took Rolls-Royce up on their marketing deal and said, hey, we're going to buy a Kestrel from you so we can test our airplane. So the first Messerschmitt had a Kestrel engine, and then, of course, and then subsequent Messerschmitts had the Daimler-Benz engines, DB601, DB605, etc. Interestingly enough, full circle, Messerschmitt sent airplanes to Franco in Spain, who was a fascist and basically neutral, but on the side of the Germans. They sent him Messerschmitts, but after the war, they had all these Messerschmitts sitting around. They couldn't get any Daimler-Benz engines for them, so they decided they were going to put Merlin engines in their Messerschmitts. So we see in the lower right, Spanish Messerschmitts with Merlin engines. Now, if you saw that 1969 movie, The Battle of Britain, and you were an aircraft spotter, basically, you recognize immediately that those Messerschmitts had Merlin engines in the movie. The Spitfires were Spitfires. The Messerschmitts were Spanish, Spanish Bouchon, the dove or pigeon, with Merlin engines. And a side story to this is actually technical advisors on that movie were Bob Tuck, for example, Battle of Britain ace, Adolf Galland, you know, the head of JG-26, later the head of all German fighter command, etc. Dowding himself was a technical advisor on this movie. Well, the pilots are all together. There are other German pilots that were going to be flying these Spanish Messerschmitts, and they said, "Hey, Adolf," or they call him Dolfo, you know. Dolfo, weren't you used to fly a very low pass, maybe 50 feet off the ground, and do a 4-point roll in your Messerschmitt? And he said, well, yeah, I did, but that was, almost 30 years ago. And he's in a business suit as well. But you know how fighter pilots are. So he hopped in this Spanish Messerschmitt, took off, and he was sweating like a pig. He got to altitude, came down. This is called beating up the airfield. And he beat up the airfield they were at and did this 4-point roll, and then came back, landed, and he was drenched. When he ruined the suit when he got out of the airplane, but of course, he did it. Be careful when you're around fighter pilots. And remember, a lot of the airline pilots were previously in the Air Force transport pilots. I'm not sure on the application form if they have a box you check. Were you a fighter pilot or a transport pilot? Anyway. And to complete the irony, the Germans actually took a captured Spitfire Mark V and put a Daimler-Benz DB605 in it and tested it. So this is what the Spitfire would have looked like if the British had to buy Daimler-Benz engines and put them in their Spitfires. The aviation industry is a fascinating thing. Now, I don't know if there are any Mormons in the audience, but if the Mormon missionaries contact you and ask you if you've ever heard of Joseph Smith, you can say, well, yes, of course. He was the chief engineer on the Supermarine Spitfire. And because of him, because he saw the development potential of the Spitfire, he developed that airplane to the final stages of the performance that it reached. Jeffrey Quill was the chief test pilot through all those years. He wrote a great book also just called Spitfire of his experiences. So we see 22,000 plus of these airplanes were produced in a 10-year period, greater than any other British aircraft, obviously. 43 different variants, flew operationally on every front, used by the air forces of 36 countries. I want to go to some of those countries and see if they've got any left. But I think that people like Cindy's brother have probably gotten there before me. Now this shows you how greatly this airplane was developed. It started out with a 1,030 horsepower Merlin engine. It weighed 5,800 pounds, went 362 miles an hour. The last mark of the Spitfire, you can see the different marks on the right, but the lower right picture is a Seafire Mark 46. I actually found this on a Russian website, but it was such a cool picture that shows what an airplane that was. That's just a picture of pure power, and you can see those contra-rotating props looked like scimitars, swords, ready to chop up any enemy that gets in their way. Anyway, the last mark of the Spitfire was a Seafire Mark 47. It weighed 12,000 pounds, had 2,300 horsepower. That's almost 3 times the horsepower of the first one. Weighed more than twice as much, and it went almost 100 miles per hour faster. We're getting in the jet realm now. And of course, they used the Seafires in Korea, etc. And the last Spitfire, the last official RAF Spitfire mission was in 1957. It was a PR-19 reconnaissance Spitfire in the Far East. It had one last mission to perform. The RAF thought that they would have to fight Indonesian Mustangs in 1963. There was some problem with some contretemps between the British and the Indonesians over something, probably oil. But the British, the RAF took their English Electric Lightnings, Mach 2 fighter interceptors, and they commissioned some Spitfires to fly combat with them. This is the ultimate aggressor squadron of Spitfires in your aggressor squadron, to see, because the Spitfire, this Mark had flying characteristics like the Mustang, to see how, to develop tactics on how they could fly their Lightnings against these Indonesian Mustangs. So that was the very last combat mission of this beautiful airplane. There were some unusual Spitfires and unusual Spitfire missions. It was a world speed record contender. In 1937, the British said, hey, we got a Spitfire, let's turn it into a world speed record airplane. So on the top you can see the high-speed Spitfire. At the 1938 World's Fair, it was displayed. It has a 4-blade wooden prop. And they figured it would probably go around 410 miles per hour, 430. It never actually flew, and they eventually converted it back into a regular combat-style Spitfire. We see the Spitfire seaplane. Spitfires are used in air-sea rescue. They'd fly out, they would drop dinghies and, flotation gear for pilots that had to ditch. We've got a hunter-killer night fighter. We've got a long-range fighter escort. In 1943, you can see in the middle picture, the long-range escort. The Wright Field took a Spitfire and put gas everywhere to extend the range. So that's a picture of the airplane. It's got wing tanks. There was gas everywhere. A pilot named Lundquist or Lundgren flew this airplane across the Atlantic. But he said, it flew like a dog. By this time, the Mustang was coming online, and we really didn't need a long-range escort as a Spitfire. There were trainers, and usually the trainers were conversions. The Irish Air Force made a conversion. Here's a Russian Air Force, a Soviet Spitfire conversion. They put a seat in back of the pilot for training purposes. There's the Photo Recon PR-19 we can see there. And then there was a Spitfire 30, they called it, the XXX. And this was an interesting mission because they basically, you can see the wing tanks on that Spitfire. It's got the invasion stripes. We had landed at Normandy and they had airstrips. RAF had airstrips in Normandy and France. This Spitfire was used to fly beer to the squadrons. And typical of our times, the government, I believe this was the Hennessy Beer Company, the government came to Hennessy and said, you can't do that. You do not have a license to export beer. And last but not least, they put tiger jaws, shark jaws on everything. This is a Spitfire with tiger jaws on it, just to fill in the picture of even the B-24s have tiger jaws on. And of course, the Flying Tigers made those famous, but it was actually the British 112 Squadron in North Africa that put the first tiger or shark jaws on their P-40s in North Africa. Remember when Triumph came out with the TR-3 sports car? They called it the Spitfire. Their motto was, you always remember your first Spitfire. I happened to get an MGA at the time, and I remember that well. Was in the shop most of the time. My first Spitfire, my first flying Spitfire, was a Gills model. You can see I put it together on the table there. There are the plans on the left. My first flight, the torque from that rubber band just turned that airplane around, and that was the last flight as well. Later on, I did a 1/4 scale Spitfire Mark 14, just very, very lightly, filling in the wings, the fuselage, this sort of thing. It was the beginnings of a 14, and I mounted it on top of my Toyota Corolla. But that was about it. That didn't get very far either. I couldn't find a buyer. Okay, now we're going to get to the battle. A few years ago, thanks to my wonderful angel wife, who found an ad in the newspaper out at the Flying Museum in Santa Monica. They were having a Battle of Britain commemoration, and they were going to have a Spitfire there, a couple of Spitfires, an ME-109, a real one, an E, not with a Merlin engine, and they were going to have a Mustang. It was there as part of the show. Well, I discovered that when they took off in that Spitfire, they didn't get more than about 4,000 feet in the air, and I couldn't even see that airplane anymore. So basically, all the people on the ground, and they would go out and watch these air battles, believe me, all the people on the ground could see were these contrails. And we see various pictures, the Messerschmitts flying in their rota, a tactic they developed for protection in Spain in the Spanish Civil War and the Condor Legion, and their fighter tactics were far ahead of the British in terms of fighter-to-fighter tactics, fighter-to-fighter warfare. You can see the Spitfire, the RAF pilots scrambling to their aircraft. You can see a downed Heinkel 111. You can see the few in front of a Spitfire, now with a three-blade, two-speed, two-pitch propeller, which tremendously increased the performance. And also an interesting note is the British, when they got 100-octane gasoline from the U.S., that really increased their, the performance of their airplanes as well, especially vis-a-vis the Germans, who were flying theirs on 87 octane, just like I put in my car. That's what that little 87 symbol in the yellow triangle on the Messerschmitts was. This is 87 gas. Anyway, you can see in the lower left-hand 3 Hurricanes in what they call the Vic formation. The Vic was great for attacking bombers, and boy, the British, their phobia was bombers. They had a mindset where the phrase that described it was, the bomber will always get through. So they were terribly afraid of bombers. So they developed the Vic, which was just a big line of airplanes, and then when they attacked bombers, they practiced attacking bombers, they peel off one at a time, just like the cavalry, and they'd make a run in and take out a bomber. The next guy, peel off, run in for the bomber. So those are the difference in tactics. Dunkirk preceded the battle. From the end of May until the 4th of June, there were 338,000 British troops stuck, surrounded by the Germans. Hitler, strangely enough, stopped the tanks at the beaches. The Panzer commander said, "Why? Let us go. We can capture all these men." Hitler said, "No, stop." What Hitler wanted to do, basically, and there's a lot of speculation on this, but basically, he didn't feel that the British were a subhuman race like he felt everybody else was. He kind of felt like the British were not as good as the Germans, but they were kind of like little brothers. So he kind of wanted to give them the chance to surrender. I mean, it's like, come on, you're surrounded, all your troops are, your whole army practically is going to be captured, all the equipment, just surrender. And then maybe you can help us fight the Russians later. But, thinking, but in a demented way. Anyway, these are pictures of Dunkirk, and probably the low point of the RAF Fighter Command was Dunkirk. As I mentioned, you could not see those airplanes in the air, but the Fighter Command had airplanes covering Dunkirk all the time, and they shot down a lot of German airplanes. But the Germans came in lower as well, and they bombed the beaches, so that when the fighter pilots landed, or some were shot down and they parachuted out and landed on the beaches, they were treated as, they were hated as like, you're RAF, where were you? We haven't seen any British airplanes. We need you, we're being bombed and strafed. They just didn't know that the RAF was covering them all the time. One pilot landed on the beach. He made his way to a destroyer to get back to England. And they treated him so coldly, he said, "Why the warm welcome?" And they said, "Well, you're RAF. You haven't helped us at all." So this was the low point, and then came the high point. They were considered the saviors of the country. This is Fuhrer Directive 16. I have decided, get this, to begin to prepare for, and if necessary, to carry out an invasion of England. There's a lot of weasel wording there, actually, for a, quote, Fuhrer Directive. You can see Admiral Raeder talking with Hitler on the left. Raeder was the only guy who had his wits about him. He said, "It can never be done. There's no way we're going to be able to do this. The weather in the channel, across the channel, is terrible. We don't have the ships, we don't have the cover." And he said, and of course the Army said, "Well, we want to hit these beaches," and you can see the Army had planned a 200-mile-long set of beaches. You can see that picture of the Zaloa Sea Lion, southern England, where they were going to land. And the Army said, "And by the way, Navy, we want to land at dawn, when the sun comes up, just like we did at Normandy in 1944, the U.S. And the British." And the Navy said, "Are you crazy? That means we'd have to go cross the channel at night, and that means the Royal Navy, the greatest navy in the world, would cut us to pieces. Nobody would make it." So now we start to get a picture of, was this thing really possible for the Germans to do? They wanted the British to think it was, And there, of course, is the planner, the army planners at the table, and Rader looking on from the side like, well, this isn't going to work, so. And of course, these are the German maps of, how the Luftwaffe was going to support the landings on the beaches. Well, those maps were never used. Here are the leaders. We know Churchill. There's the corporal from Austria, from Bavaria, saluting the people that loved him so much. There's Keith Park, head of 11 Group. Kesselring, he was head of Luftwaffe 2. Göring, of course, head of the Luftwaffe. Sperle, he was head of Luftwaffe 3. The Luftwaffe 2 and 3 were the two in France, and there's Luftflotte 5, flotilla, in Norway. They did a couple of missions, realized that, hey, their Messerschmitts didn't have range to escort the bombers, so they quickly stopped flying missions against northern England. So basically it was between Luftflotte 2 and 3, and the hero of this piece was Hugh Dowding. Sperle in the lower right looks like a cartoon. And actually, what's funny is the famous German ace in World War I and a Hollywood stunt pilot, he was the German guy in the movie, what was that movie with Robert Redford? Waldo Pepper. He was the guy that was fictionalized in that as a German pilot. But he was a great cartoonist as well. So in the book Fighter, Len Dayton has added a few of Udet's cartoons and caricatures of Göring and Sperle and Kesselring and this sort of thing. Kesselring always had a smile on his face. They thought he was ridiculous because of that, but he was obviously having a good time. Sperle was a Sybarite like Göring. His fighter headquarters were the Palais de Luxembourg in Paris, the most lavish hotel you could find in Paris. That's where Sperle set up his headquarters. Okay, blood, toil, tears, and sweat. Churchill's speech, 13 May 1940, the invasion is coming. Our army is decimated. The Germans have swept everything before them. France, and then, of course, Norway, Holland. It was all over. I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. Kennedy said that in his famous encapsulation of Churchill, he mobilized the English language and took it to war. Between Dowding, Churchill, and Park, really, the British had a winning team. And they won. Actually, their policy was not to win. Their policy was just not to lose. You ask, what is our policy? I will say it is to wage war by sea, land, and air with all our might and with all the strength that God can give us, to wage war against a monstrous tyranny that's trying to raise its head again, I think, if recent news reports are any indication, never surpassed in the dark and lamentable catalog of human crime. That is our policy. You ask, what is our aim? I can answer in one word: victory. Victory at all costs, victory in spite of all terror, victory however long and hard the road may be, for without victory there is no survival. That was the darkest time in the history of Great Britain. And here's this man saying these crazy things and backing them up with nothing but his courage. Here's more. We shall fight on the beaches. I won't go over this, but this is 4 June 1940. We shall go on to the end. We shall fight in France. We shall fight on the seas and oceans. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender. And if, which I do not for a moment believe, this island or a large part of it were subjugated and starving, then our empire beyond the seas, armed and guarded by the British fleet, would carry on the struggle until, in God's good time, the New World, with all its power and might, steps forth to the rescue and the liberation of the old, i.e. the U.S. had to come into the war to win it. Okay, their finest hour. Now, it's very interesting. This is also Churchill addressing the House of Commons. What General Weygand called the Battle of France is over. I expect that the Battle of Britain is about to begin. There's where we get the title of this battle. The Battle of Britain is about to begin. Upon this battle depends the survival of Christian civilization. Upon it depends our own British life and the long continuity of our institutions and our empire. The whole fury and might of the enemy must very soon be turned on us. It's interesting that at the end of the war, Hitler tried to crib Churchill's speeches to buoy up the German people. And of course, the Allies listening in on the radio, haven't we heard that before? Hitler knows, this is quoting Churchill, Hitler knows that he will have to break us in this island or lose the war. If we can stand up to him, all Europe may be free and the life of the world may move forward into broad, sunlit uplands. But if we fail, then the whole world, including the United States, including, and of course we know we have German maps now of their strategy to gradually in peacetime surround the U.S. and then make them an offer, including all that we have known and cared for, will sink into the abyss of a new dark age made more sinister and perhaps more protracted by the lights of perverted science. Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duties and so bear ourselves that if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will say this was their finest hour. Now Churchill knew his history, and he knew that Herr Hitler, Herr Hitler's big campaign slogan was, "The Reich will last 1,000 years." So Churchill was playing off Hitler's words by saying, well, if the British Empire lasts 1,000 years, he wasn't boasting about how it was going to, but he said, if it does, then this will be their finest hour. His famous speech to House of Commons, 20 August 1940, never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. All hearts go out to the fighter pilots whose brilliant actions we see with our own eyes day after day, but we must never forget that all the time, night after night, month after month, our bomber squadrons travel far into Germany, find their targets in the darkness by the highest navigational skill, aim their attacks, often under the heaviest fire, often with serious loss, etc., etc. So in this speech, people forget that he also mentioned the heroes of Bomber Command. And the casualties in Bomber Command during the war were absolutely horrendous. So here we have this. As he was practicing his speech on the way to House of Commons, his friend, General Hastings Ismay, said, originally Churchill was going to say, never in the course of history was so much owed by so many to so few. And General Ismay said, wait a minute, Winston, what about Jesus Christ and the apostles? So Winston said, Ismay's nickname was Pug. He said, thank you, Pug. I'm going to change that line. So here's the way the battle worked. 5 main phases, 26 June, 20 July. These were the Sturmgriffe, the nuisance raids, scattered small-scale probing attacks, both day and night, armed reconnaissance, mine laying from 4 July, daylight. And the Germans called this Kanalkampf, the channel battles, basically trying to intimidate the British into not using London to unload their ships, the harbors there. They weren't able to do it. 17 July, 12 August, daylight Kanalkampf attacks on shipping. They intensify, increasing attacks on the ports and coastal airfields, night raids on the RAF and aircraft manufacturers. 13 August, 6 December, this was the Eagle attack, Adler Griff, the main assault, attempt to destroy the RAF in southern England, and they came close, they thought, but they didn't realize that for every airplane that they destroyed in the RAF airfields, there was a replacement airplane ready. The British they had plenty of airplanes in store. They had plenty of pilots to replace the pilots. The only problem was the training of those pilots sometimes was not as good. But they were not really in danger of destroying the RAF. And the British didn't realize this. They kept believing that the RAF had only so many airplanes. We shot down this many today. And their intelligence officer, Beppo Schmidt, said, hey, you don't have to worry. There are no more RAF fighters left. So basically, on 7 December, the Blitz commences, main focus of day and night attacks on London. Because of a navigational mistake, one German bomber dropped its bombs actually on London rather than the suburbs. Winston Churchill said, all right, that does it. We're going to bomb Berlin. So they bombed Berlin, I think, the next night or a few nights later. And Hitler was incensed, and Hitler's chief of staff of the Luftwaffe, Yashonik, said, now can we start terror bombing London? And typical of Hitler, he said, no, I'm the one who gets to say who terror bombs who. They did start bombing London after the bombing raid, the British raid on Berlin. So September 15th, they call the Battle of Britain Day. It's celebrated to this day. Basically, the British claimed they shot down 185. There were two major raids of 250 airplanes each. The British actually shot down, I believe, 61 German airplanes. They claimed 185, and that's what the newspaper said. The bomber pilots were totally demoralized because, wait a minute, where did all these airplanes come from? Beppo Schmidt told us there was no RAF left. So morale was getting very low, and the pilots in the RAF were getting very tired, but they carried on. The last phase of the Battle of Britain was the night bombing raids, the Blitz, mostly on London. Daylight attacks were just small fighter bomber raids. Again, the nuisance raids. They tried to escort a couple of bombers to draw up the RAFs. They'd have 100 fighters escorting a couple of bombers and to get the RAF to come up. Of course, Dowding and Park were not that dumb. They knew that, just two bombers, they weren't going to be able to destroy anything, so they didn't take the bait. Here's what we're looking at. Basically, we've got a lot of German airplanes, but they didn't have the production capacity to replace either their airplanes or their pilots, whereas the British did. We had basically 2 Hurricanes to every Spitfire, but many pilots said they preferred the Hurricane. The guns were closer together. It was an excellent gun platform and had a better maneuverability than the Messerschmitt. Others preferred the Spitfire, and of course the Spitfire became immortal. But it's interesting, you look at the total figures, for example, Hurricanes, on the books they had 463. Actually, the ones they could use that was serviceable, ready to take off, was a far lower number, 347, and that's what that second number is for all those airplanes, is the serviceability number. Spitfires, they had 286 on the books, 160 would actually be able to take off at any one time, that were ready to go. And the same for the Germans, lower serviceability rates. The British were not cowed. These are some fun cartoons from Punch, and then some photos. In the upper right, you can see the Home Guard with sticks and shovels and things practicing how to capture a German tank. You can see these housewives. Now, the Germans dropped leaflets on the British, and you can see it says, "A last appeal to reason. Surrender to us." And you can see these housewives looking at these pamphlets like, oh, come on. And of course, the cartoon in Punch, Herr Hitler is standing outside the moat. He can't get into the British castle, and he's saying through his megaphone, "Surrender or die." And he's jumping up and down in frustration. There's the Punch cartoon in the top center, says, "Meanwhile in Britain, the entire population, faced by the threat of invasion, has been flung into a state of complete panic." And you can see that, no, they're actually following the usual procedure. After work, they're going to the pub. But something that would have been very serious for the Germans if the Navy had been able to get across the channel at all was a plan, and they were implementing it, to basically flood the beaches with petroleum and then set it on fire. So I don't think that any German soldier would want to land on a beach that looked like that. The women played a tremendous role. This is the Dowding system, depending on radar, filter centers, plotting of groups. You can see the plotting table there. You can see upstairs, you can see the commanders looking at the plots on the table, and they really were able to keep track of the German raids. And a big part was played by the Royal Observer Corps. Later, my dad in the 50s was part of the U.S. Air Force's Ground Observer Corps, before we had radars and things to cover, low-level radars, and that was, I believe, 58,000 people had stations where they reported to the Air Force airplanes flying through their sectors. And it was the only time, according to the Smithsonian, there was an article, it was called the only time that civilian housewives could scramble U.S. fighter planes. So anyway, there's the radar. The Germans knew about radar, but they just could not destroy it because look at the radar, the chain home radar system. It's a bunch of lattices. There's nothing for bullets really to hit. Of course, in the movies, you see the bullets always hit on those lattices because the production people in the movie have put those little charges there. Okay, this is the next to last chart. So this is a true-false test. Britain was at the mercy of the Germans after Dunkirk. True or false? False. They weren't. Hitler hated the English and wanted to destroy them. True or false? That's kind of false. He really wanted to intimidate them into joining him. Yeah. The British people were united and defiant. True, false? They were, but there were a lot at the beginning that were really wondering, what's going on? Are we going to, because they weren't privy to all the information that Dowding and Churchill, etc. had. So there was a lot of problem, people complaining about, we want to know the truth, the news, this sort of thing. Later, during the Blitz, there's nothing like bombing somebody to make them wake up and fight back. You know, it's not a good thing to do if you want. It doesn't cow people into submission. It basically makes them hate you more. This is something that they realized in the bombing campaigns. Churchill inspired everyone to fight on. True or false? The majority, yes, but there was a minority who said, Churchill, he's a crazy guy. Okay, Operation Sea Lion was a bluff. By the way, originally the German army wanted to call this Operation Lion. Operation Lion. Now, a lion is something, you know, you're afraid of. The British lion, obviously. They're going to conquer the British lion. Hitler came along and said, but we're going across the water, so I want to call it Sea Lion. There's a big difference in intimidation factor between a lion. Just go to any zoo. There's a big difference between intimidation between a lion and a sea lion. So again, the German general staff went along with it, but, you know. Hitler had the full support of the German military. True, false? False. They tried to kill him a few times before the war and a few times after the war started. This is interesting. The American Eagle Squadron volunteers played an important role in the Battle of Britain. True, false? No, actually not. In September, the first Eagle Squadron was organized, although there were 7 Americans who actually flew in the Battle of Britain, one of whom was a boyfriend of my wife's aunt from was it Santaquin, Utah? Chesley Peterson. He was a BYU graduate. He became the first leader of the Eagle Squadron and then the U.S. 4th Fighter Group. Youngest colonel in the Air Force, that's Chesley Peterson. She knew him in high school and had a crush on him. Okay, so the next one, the Luftwaffe vastly outnumbered the Royal Air Force. True, false? Actually false. They were pretty evenly matched, as were the capabilities of their airplanes. The Spitfire and the Messerschmitt were pretty evenly matched. Yeah, well, here we go. The Spitfire is far superior to the Messerschmitt 109. Well, I already answered that. Depends on pilot skill. So much depends on pilot skill. The vast majority of German aircraft were shot down by Spitfires. True, false? Actually false. 2/3 were shot down by hurricanes. The quality of intelligence estimates determined victory. True, false? Oh yes, true. There's Beppo Schmidt and his crazy intelligence estimates. Hey, what's wrong with you guys? The Luftwaffe doesn't exist anymore. The pilots, well, come for a ride with us in our bomber the next time. Ultra played a big role in the Battle of Britain. You know, that was the code machine that captured by the British where they could decode the German signals. True, false? Actually, that was false. Ultra didn't really play a big role until later. AI radar replaced carrots as a night fighter, that's air intercept radar, replaced carrots as a night fighter interception aid. True, false? I have to laugh because, you know, Actually, in the Battle of Britain, there were Millennium bombers with air intercept radars. They weren't very effective, but they were actually there. They shot down a few German bombers, but the British did not want the Germans to know that they had air intercept radar on their aircraft. So they, when asked, they interviewed night fighter pilots and stuff like that. The night fighter pilots, they would say, well, how do you find those German airplanes at night? They'd say, well, we eat a lot of carrots to get a lot of vitamin A before we go on a mission. The Hurricane was not liked by RAF pilots. Well, we've already answered that one. They did like it a lot. Morale was high among pilots of both air forces. It started to get very low, especially with the Germans. The Blitz on London began as a mistake, kind of, but there was always part of the plan to terror bomb London, just like they did with the cities in Belgium, Holland, and France. They would terror bomb the cities so that the people would flee the bombing and clog up the roads so that the German forces could attack and the defending forces couldn't use the roads. They were clogged with refugees. So that was really their plan. Yes, they were planning to bomb London. It just happened before they wanted to do it. The top RAF Battle of Britain ace was British. True or false? This is kind of controversial, but according to most accounts, the top ace in the Battle of Britain was not British. Do you recall who it was? Actually, it was a Czech named Joseph František. He was in the Czech Air Force, and in Munich, the British, Chamberlain, and the French premier talked with Hitler and said, sure, you can have Czechoslovakia. And Hitler said, yeah, if you'll give me Czechoslovakia without a fight, I have no more territorial ambitions. Cross my heart and hope to die. This is Hitler talking, you realize. So when the Germans came into Munich, František was a fighter pilot. He took off for Poland, and on the way he strafed the Germans. He landed in Poland just in time to join the Polish Air Force. He fought the Germans in the Polish Air Force. When they were defeated, he escaped to France. He flew with the French, shot down more Germans with the French Air Force. When they were defeated, he went to England and he joined the RAF, and he was still the top ace in the RAF in the Battle of Britain. He was crazy because he had no air discipline. When he was in a formation, you're supposed to work as a team, right? As soon as he saw a German, he would take off no matter what. They couldn't stop him. He was scolded by that. It didn't stop him. So finally, the Polish 303 squadron said, we'll make you a guest of our squadron and you can fly anyhow you want. Fighter tactics of the Luftwaffe were superior to those of the RAF. At the beginning, yes. RAF bomber and coastal commands played no role in the Battle of Britain. No, actually, you remember Churchill mentioned the bomber command specifically. Coastal command bombed the barges on the coast. They also protected the British shipping, and of course and they also laid mines around the channel ports on the European side. And of course, Bomber Command bombed Germany during this whole time, and they also bombed those barges. The Germans were unaware of the British radar capability. True, false? Actually, that's false. They were well aware of the German radar capability. In 1937, Erhard Milch, the head of the German, he was a general field marshal of the German Luftwaffe, was visiting, this is before the war, he was visiting the RAF, and he was hobnobbing with the high command of the RAF, and he asked a question. How are you coming, with a German accent, of course, how are you coming on your new radar experiments? So, of course, they like to brag. I don't think they told him much. But just before World War II, just before the Germans invaded Poland in September, in August of 1939, the Graf Zeppelin II went on a goodwill flight. This was a Zeppelin, like the blimp, went on a goodwill flight along the coast of England to show the amity and friendship that the Germans had for the British people. The RAF didn't fall for this at all. The Graf Zeppelin was full of radio detection equipment. This was what we would call today an ELINT mission. They were trying to, with their instruments in the Graf Zeppelin, figure out what frequencies the chain home British radars were on, what their strength was, what coverage they had, this sort of thing. The RAF did not fall for that at all. They turned off all the radars while that Graf Zeppelin was making its goodwill tour. Women played a key role in the battle, yes, yes, yes. By the end of 1940, there were 100,000 women in the Women's Auxiliary Air Force in Britain. And they were heroines. They gave their lives in this battle as well. RAF survival hung by a thread as airfields were attacked. Well, we know the answer to that. Not true. The RAF big wing tactic convinced the Germans that they could not win. This is a whole different topic, but basically the big wing was not the thing to do, because all the big wing could do, the big wing basically was Douglas Bader and Trafford Lee Mallory, who was the head of 12 Group, which was north of 11 Group where all the action was. Mallory wanted to get into the action, so did Bader, so they said, okay, what we want to do is we want to gather 100 airplanes together, and then we'll go shoot, then we'll go shoot down the bombers and everything. The only problem was, by the time they got all those 100 bombers assembled at the altitude to attack the Germans had already dropped their bombs and they were heading home. Whereas Dowding and Park said, we're going to send up as many airplanes as we can in small numbers to attack those airplanes, terribly outnumbered, but in that attack, we're going to break up those bombers, split them up, they're going to go every which way, jettison their bombs, head back, and then we'll take on the fighters. Basically, the Hurricanes took on the bombers, the Spitfires took on the fighter. But that was the basic flaw of the big wing tactic is, well, you have to bomb the bombers after they've dropped the bombs and killed thousands of people. So don't ever believe it when people say, oh yeah, the big thing was right, the big wing was right. Later, Adolf Galland, trying to defend Germany against the American bombers, he came up, he resurrected the big wing idea. He was always talking to Goering about we need more fighters in the air at one time, because there are thousands of American bombers. So that was kind of resurrecting as that. Of course, Galland is famous in the Battle of Britain when he was interviewed by Goering, who was quite querulous about complaining about why aren't you fighter guys protecting the bombers better? Galland's famous response was, and of course Goering said in his grandiose way, I will give you anything you need to protect those bombers, Galland's response was, you're probably aware, yes, all right, Herr Goering, Herr Luftwaffe Commodore, General Marschall, etc. Give me a squadron of Spitfires. Basically, Hugh Dowding's contribution to winning the Battle of Britain was acknowledged only much later, yes. As soon as the Battle of Britain was over, he was fired, retired. Actually, he was sent to work on some training documents, and then in early 1942, he was retired. He was immediately replaced as the head of Fighter Command. And Park also, head of 11 Group, these two guys won the Battle of Britain. Park was immediately dismissed. Sholto Douglas took his place. Trafford Lee Mallory, I believe, became head of Fighter Command. And Park was sent to be head of Training Command. And neither one of them were acknowledged. Dowding actually wrote a book, 12 Angels on High. Anyway, it was an account of the Battle of Britain that came out in 1942 or 43. And it was suppressed. They didn't allow it to be published. There was a government book on the Battle of Britain. It came out in 1942, the official government account of the Battle of Britain. Guess what? Dowding and Park were not mentioned in that official book. And last true false, the most serious threat to Britain's survival was not German bombers. What do you think it was? U-boats. Yes, until 1943, actually, Britain's survival hung on a thread. So last chart, I met these guys. Adolf Gallant and Bob Tuck. I was actually doing some paintings, and they were in town in Salt Lake City. And I thought, for the Zion's bookstore, I knew the guy. Obviously, I read a lot of books, and I spent a lot of time at Zion's bookstore. He said, they're coming. It's a special program. I said, hey, I'll do a newspaper picture for you. So that's in the upper left. And then they came, and I presented 2 paintings to them. So there they are. That's me with Bob Tuck and with Adolf Gallant. They were very grateful. They said these things are going to hang in our houses. And Bob Tuck said, you should meet my friend who's also an aviation artist. And let's see, I can't recall his name right now, but he's Frank Wooten. He said, you should meet my friend Frank Wooten. He's also an aviation artist. So that is pretty much it. Any questions? How many German aircraft were shot down over Britain, especially London? Those numbers, gosh, I'd have to consult my notes, but we're looking probably at about 1,700, around that. But again, these are not, the quote official figures don't really jive with a lot of research that's been done, but we're looking at, about around 1,500, 2,000 airplanes. Would the Spitfires have to close to a certain range before they could start shooting, basically? Yes. Basically, the Spitfires had 8 machine guns, and they were spread out in the wings. So they were basically harmonized to converge at a certain point, and this was usually about 300 yards. Any closer than that, and you were going to get shot up by gunners probably, but people got a lot closer. And any further away, and the bullets start to diverge again. And so that was about the range. With the Hurricane, you had those 8 guns right in a row. They were very close together, so you didn't have that problem as much. And by the way, the Germans had a fuel-injected engine, so they could do what's called a bunt. If they were somewhere on their tail, they could just go over like a cliff. The British couldn't do that. When they tried to follow them in doing that bunt, the float in the radiator would clog the engine, and their engine would stop. So they had to do a roll and then roll to take off after the airplanes. Interestingly enough, a woman who worked at Rolls-Royce, one of the workers, came up with an idea. I don't think she was an engineer, but she said, why don't we put a little disc in the radiators of our engines so that when they do that bunt, it won't flood the engine with fuel. So they put that in there. Her name is, Tilly, something. But anyway, she made a great contribution to the performance of the Merlin engine and the aircraft that it powered. Any other questions? In the movie Dunkirk, it's implied or shown that Churchill and the RAF are holding back their fighter planes from covering Dunkirk, protecting Dunkirk, because they don't want to lose them. They're afraid that they'll lose their fighters and Hitler will be able to attack and they won't be able to defend themselves. Is that right? That's kind of half true. Basically, before the Battle of Britain, and as the French were suffering from the German attacks in the Blitzkrieg, the French premier asked Churchill to send more British fighter planes to help protect the French army. Well, the French were losing big time. They were totally disorganized. Churchill was encouraged by his cabinet things. Yes, send more, help the French, send more fighters. Here's where Dowding came in, and he was not liked for this. Dowding, when Churchill asked Dowding to send more Spitfires, more fighters to the French, Dowding said no. This is a losing battle, and if we send the fighters you want to send, we will not truly have enough to protect ourselves. We'll be down below the squadron strength that we project that we'll need to defeat the Luftwaffe that we know of it. And they had pretty good intelligence. But as far as covering Dunkirk, I think the RAF really threw in everything they could. Any other questions? Was there a reason that they so immediately let Dowding and Park go? Yes. The big wing theorist and the head of number 12 group, Trafford Lee Mallory, had a squadron leader, I believe, in his group, who was a minister of parliament, an MP. So he got the ear of the cabinet minister for air, because, they would meet in the House of Commons, and said, Dowding and Park are really bad guys. They're doing it all wrong. You've got to get this big wing thing going, like like the head of 12 group, the Holy Saint Lee Mallory wants you to do. So basically, Dowding was called in, Park was called in. What are you doing? Why are you doing this? They were grilled and this sort of thing, and they gave the answers. And that was what really got them in trouble. Is they caused they rocked the boat. They made waves. They said, no, we're not getting the support we need from 12 group, i.e. Saint Lee Mallory. And interestingly enough, after the Battle of Britain, right after the Battle of Britain, Lee Mallory, of course, became head of 12 group, of 11 group, took Park's job. He was fired, sent to training command. They did a big war game simulation with Spitfires, Hurricanes, Millenniums, and this sort of thing. A big simulation to prove that the big wing theory would have won the Battle of Britain, that it was sound. And guess what? In war games they have umpires and this sort of thing. They ran this big simulation, and the umpire said, "Didn't work. Kenly and Biggin Hill are already destroyed, and you've lost the war." So the simulation didn't even work. So you can tell I'm not a proponent of the big wing theory. Any other questions or comments? How does the elliptical wing enhance the performance, overall performance? On the Spitfire, we're talking about, again, that coefficient of lift that is consistent, the same throughout the entire span of the wing. That doesn't mean there's more lift on the wing tips, because there's not more lift, there's more lift in the wing roots, but the lift is consistent so that the airflow is more efficient and predictable. Yeah, thank you. There's an aerodynamicist in the audience. And then, of course, they put the fillets on there so that you don't get as much turbulence in the joining of the fuselage with the wings. The question was better turn performance, and yes, basically, turn performance is also a function of wing loading, and that means, the total pounds that the wing has to support. So the wing loading of the Spitfire was much lower than the Messerschmitt. The Messerschmitt had a higher wing loading, and you would think that it would have a poorer turn radius, but the Messerschmitt on this high wing loading wing put movable slats, so that when you reached a certain lower, in a turn, when you reached a certain speed, and airflow, these slats would automatically just come out, and they would provide better lift, more lift for the wing. It's like if you're sitting in a window seat on a 747, you're going to land, you see all these things come out of the wings all of a sudden. That was basically what those things were on the Messerschmitt's wings that allowed it to turn. The question was, why was the main landing gear designed where it was, so close together? Well, it's kind of funny, because in both Messerschmitt and Mitchell decided they wanted the fuselage to support the stress and strain, the compression when they landed from the landing gear, rather than the wings to have to do that. So that's why it's there. The Germans hated the Messerschmitt landing gear like that, because they lost, I think, about 5% of their Messerschmitts just from landing accidents, from the landing gear collapsing. They called it the famous and much hated Messerschmitt because of its X-Beine, its knock-knees. They called it the knock-kneed Messerschmitt, and they said, we don't need the enemy, we're losing our Messerschmitts to the landing gear. And basically the Spitfire had that same, ground looping problem, this sort of thing, but it wasn't as much of a problem as it was with the Messerschmitt. Is there a location around here where there's a Spitfire on display? A Spitfire, I believe, is going to be coming to the museum early next year. As far as Spitfires on display, there's Chino, Camarillo, Palm Springs. Yeah, you've got to, if you haven't seen one of those things on the ground, they just look like a toy. You see them out there, and the closer you get, the more you see, like, this is a beautiful piece of sculpture. And yet it's a symbol of the courage of a people like Churchill who would not give up. So thank you very much.
Thank you for watching Peninsula Seniors Out and About. I'm Betty Wheaton. See you next time.